And I think there might be 1 or 2 books left, inshallah. All right, Bismillah. So we left off, and it's working now, so that's good. Let's just make it as slides instead of this way. We left off talking about the importance of recognizing the Islamic aspect when it comes to mental health, and understanding that Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran calls our attention to situations of difficulty, of stress, of pain, and that this is part of the human experience, that we're not alone as we go through these difficulties. Okay? Now, sometimes when someone is struggling though, we will tell them things like, just wake up, just take a shower, just go to the masjid, just get therapy, talk to a counselor. And we get very frustrated when they don't want to. Or sometimes we'll, sit beside them and say, well, tell me what's wrong. How can I help you if you won't talk to me, right? Maybe we have teenagers who are in their room with the door closed and they're refusing to come out, right? Maybe we have, spouses who, stonewall or shut down and refuse to connect with us. And many times, when we look at someone who is struggling with depression, when we say, do something, that something may be as small as just waking up in the morning. That something may be just taking a shower. That something may be, smiling. And sometimes that's all that the person can do. And so learning how to meet people where they're at, recognizing that when we say, try, strive, it doesn't necessarily have to be big movements or something that's very large that's occurring. Sometimes it's something very small, that somebody striving looks like a smile, that somebody striving looks like what Maryam alayhi salam was commanded to do, which was to shake the trunk of a palm tree. Sometimes it's a small movement, and that's all the person can do in that moment. And we know, again, when Maryam alayhi salam is commanded to go back to her people, she is told not to speak. Because sometimes in those moments of difficulty, you can't speak. And sometimes all that's needed is for you to sit beside a person and just say, I'm here. You don't need to talk. You don't need to tell me what's going on, but I'm here. And sometimes that's what's needed. So we talked a little bit about this verse from the Quran yesterday, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. Do not despair of the mercy of Allah. As we talked about the transitioning, right? Sadness, grief, sorrow, depression, despair is often that end point. When you feel like nothing's going to get better, when you feel like this is the end, I can't go on from here, that can often be the falling in despair. And we want to make sure that we have those preventative measures in place so that no one reaches that point of despair. Because once you reach that point of despair, often that spells, for many people, the end, the taking of their life, the deciding that they can't keep going because there's nothing there for them. So it is normal to feel a lot of emotions at once. It is normal to be able to feel sadness, but to also feel strength. It is normal to feel anxious about the future, but also to have tawakkul. It is normal to feel one way, but also continue to strive in a state that pushes you towards that which is better. And for those of you who are familiar with, dialectical behavioral therapy, for example, dialectical behavioral therapy focuses on that duality, on that understanding that you can be very sad, you can be very scared, you can be going through difficulty, but you can also be strong, you can also exhibit love, you can also connect with others. So being able to not have an either-or perspective. Now I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the more intense mental health outcomes. We talk about depression very frequently, we talk about anxiety frequently, but some of the mental health outcomes that are really impacting our communities that are not talked about as much and are very prevalent are BPD. So we are seeing more incidents of BPD-1 and BPD-2. People sometimes confuse BPD with, bipolar disorder with borderline personality disorder. They are not the same. They are two different diagnoses. When you look at the two different types of bipolar, there is a bipolar in which there are, shifts in terms of responses and reactions, shifts in terms of, how situations will impact people. But it can be classified with mania, where there can be excessive times or periods where there is action, there is hyperactivity, there is movement forward, there's motivation, and then that can be followed by a slump. There can also be uncharacteristic outcomes. I remember, years ago, I had a client who the family had called me because this was a very quiet person who they felt was struggling with depression. And suddenly, this person had been arrested for breaking into a store in the mall for items that they would never even use. And this was a manic episode. Excuse me. So we know that bipolar is something that is, again, diagnosable and it is treatable, okay? And I think this is what we want to really understand when it comes to mental health illnesses. They are not curable, they are treatable, meaning that someone who struggles with depression, that may be a factor in terms of their psyche, in terms of, and again, not situational, but chronic or clinical. Someone who has bipolar, someone who is diagnosed with OCD, that's part of who they are, but it is treatable, not curable. And treatable means that there are different treatment methods that work. And it's not always the first time, first try, it's going to be the right fit. I can't tell you how many times I have talked to people who have said, well, I went to counseling and it made it worse, or I had a therapist and it didn't help. Well, seeking counsel, seeking a therapist, I think it's a lot like shopping for shoes. It's not always going to be the right fit the first time. Don't stop. You keep trying. The same thing with medication. Sometimes there are different responses to Xanax or Lexapro. Sometimes the amount that you're given, the dosage, has to increase, it has to decrease. It's not an exact science, but you can't just throw in the towel because you went to counseling once and it didn't help. You can't just say, well, I tried anti-anxiety pills or antidepressants and it didn't work. Yes, maybe it wasn't the right treatment plan for you, but seek out those treatments because these illnesses are treatable. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something that we've seen, again, an increase in post-COVID in particular. And essentially, it's a response to trauma when you're outside of that trauma, but your body and your mind is now unpacking it, and now you're responding in ways that makes it difficult to move forward. OCD behaviors, I mentioned yesterday that scrupulosity is one of the forms of OCD that we tend to see prevalently among Muslim communities in particular. Scrupulosity is a form of OCD that's linked to religious ritual. So someone who is constantly making wudu, somebody who prays but repeats one verse of the Quran over and over and over again, somebody who stays in prostration for hours on end, somebody who, we had a client years ago who had grooves and marks in his fingers, like they were literally worn away, the skin from the bone, because of the consistency of the tasbih, where he would always consistently be moving his hand with the tasbih to the point of self-harm, essentially. And so we tend to see scrupulosity as a religious ritual or behavior that is done over and over and over again, oftentimes because there is a feeling that it may not be accepted. A few years back, we had a client, and alhamdulillah, he's doing much, much better now and allows us to share his story. He was a refugee client from Syria, and when he had arrived in the US, he was considered one of those model citizens, got a job right away, learned English, was, driving, taking care of his family. He was about 24 or 25 at that time. And we had received a call saying that his family was worried about him. He had been fired from his job. He was working in a hardware store, and that he was suddenly on the decline. And he was spending hours in his room, and they didn't know what was wrong. So we met with the client, and we spoke to him, and our policy at Cornerstone, we use the 3 cups of tea method, which means rather than from the first 30 minutes or 45 minutes, we try to get to the heart of the problem and the diagnosis. We try to get to know the person first, and we usually don't ask about what the clinical difficulty is until at least the 3rd or the 4th session, because how can you open up to someone, how can you trust someone and talk to them if they don't know you? So after several sessions, we started diving into what the difficulty was, and we could see there were some indicators that OCD may be prevalent, certain fidgeting, certain nonverbal cues that were showing us, certain elements that we thought that might be a situation. And so we found out that he had been fired from his job because he was spending hours in the bathroom. And he was staying in his room all the time because he was constantly repeating his salah over and over again, to the point where he wasn't sleeping at night because he would pray Isha 20, 30, 40, 50 times even, because he thought he wasn't doing it right. And we couldn't understand, what had happened. And as we started to talk to him, we realized that there had been a trigger that re-traumatized him. He was working in the hardware store and he had climbed up on a ladder. And while he was there, someone wearing army fatigues had kind of walked underneath him. And when he looked at that face of that person, it took him back to a situation that happened to him when he was an 11-year-old boy, where someone from the army had violated him. And he had never addressed that trauma. Oftentimes, in order for us to survive, we suppress traumas. Something that has happened in our childhood, something that we've experienced, we push it down in our mind and we say, I'm not going to think about it, because how can I function if I think about it? When the mind and the body feels, again, a sense of safety, a sense of physiological well-being, that's often when the psychological side will revisit past traumas and say, okay, you're ready to feel now. And if there is no outlet, if there is no way of working through that past trauma, oftentimes it'll manifest in some of these mental health outcomes. And so for him, this trauma came to the forefront again, and everything was very vivid, and he could remember every moment, every feeling, everything, that lack of safety that he had suppressed for so many years. And because he felt that he had been violated, that he was dirty, he wasn't clean, he was constantly making wudu, he was constantly repeating his prayer. And it's, a lot of times we'll say, well, it's a waswasa, and yes, there can be, we're not stepping away from the Islamic interpretation of mental health outcomes. Yes, there can be, issues from the jinn, there can be sihr, there can be hasad, absolutely, we're not denying that. But we also see that the result of that can be mental health outcomes that are treatable. Do the ruqya, but also take the medicine. Speak to the counselor, and also pray your salah. Make dua, but also address the core of the issue as well. Schizophrenia is another common mental health outcome that we tend to see. Schizophrenia is often genetic. There can also be paranoid schizophrenia. I remember we had a client years ago who did have paranoid schizophrenia, and when he came to our office, he was convinced that numbers meant certain things, and that the number on our office door was actually referring to something that he had experienced many years ago, and that meant that we were in collusion with, someone who he would see in front of his house pushing a baby stroller, that he was convinced that that person was actually a spy who wanted to harm him. A lot of, what we'd consider, paranoid schizophrenia or delusions that were leading him to live a life of fear. And this was someone who barely ever stepped out of his home and who would start to make negative connections, and that would be a case where the schizophrenia is very prevalent, very diagnosable, but sometimes the seedlings of schizophrenia can go unnoticed. Sometimes schizophrenia is misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder, but it is much more intense than bipolar. There are certain red flag behaviors that we do want to address and that we want to know how to react to. Any sudden change in behavior. Many parents will ask me this, that, my child was so happy and smiley, and then they hit puberty, and now they're sad, and they're emo, and they're in their room all the time, and they don't want to leave, and they're always on their phone. There is a difference between normative child development and that which would be cause for concern. Normative child development is, yes, at the age of puberty, in that second stage of tarbiyah, our children will turn away from us, but will often turn towards friends, turn towards other role models. If the turning away is turning towards a void, where they're not turning towards anything else, but they are pulling away from us, but they're not connecting with friends, they're not connecting with other people, they're not being involved in other things, to me, that's cause for concern. And I would much rather be concerned and talk to my child, talk to my family, talk to them about what's going on, than ignore it and say, oh, it's just normal teenage stuff, right? The child who maybe was happy-go-lucky and is suddenly crying all the time. The child who, is angry, and that anger, remember how we talked about before the misplaced emotions, how sometimes the emotion of grief, of sadness, can be exhibited or elicited in the form of anger. So these to me are red flag behaviors. There are other more obvious ones, of course. Self-harm is not just a cry for attention. Self-harm is a cry for help. If your child, if you as an adult, if a friend is self-harming, it is absolutely a red flag and cause for concern. And even if they are self-harming just because they want you to make an appointment with a therapist, make that appointment. Don't think to yourself, oh, you're just overreacting, you're just being dramatic, you're just having a tantrum because I said no to going to the mall. No, when someone gets to that point where they're willing to harm themselves, they are crying out for help. Take them to a counselor. See what's going on, understand what they're experiencing. And suicide ideation and attempts, of course, I would rather we all err on the side of caution. So the child who says something like, I want to kill myself, take it seriously. Not when they're joking and they're like, oh, I'm gonna kill myself, right? There's different ways. This is where the nonverbal cues are super important, right? In that case, you still wanna address it. You still want to tell them, that's not something that we joke about. This is serious. People truly feel this way. Talk to me, are you feeling that way? But there are other cues that will tell us that there is suicide ideation, thoughts of self-harm that may be leading to something larger. I think yesterday, Sister Isra, may Allah Azza wa Jal reward her and grant her family sabr and ease her pain and her heart. But she talked about losing her son and how he started giving things away, right? Giving away valuables, giving away prized possessions. One of my children's friends, and again, alhamdulillah, he's in treatment now, but he had called up my son and he said, hey, come on over, I want to give you all my sneakers. And my son was like, what? Like, you love sneakers. You have, I don't know, $800 Dunks and $500 Yeezys or whatever they are. And so my son had gone over and he saw that the room was practically bare. He was giving his sneakers away to all his friends. He was giving, his PS4 or PS, whatever they're called, the game station, and so, the other friends, and my son was about 18 at the time, the other friends all thought it was so cool. They were like, oh, what'd you get from so-and-so? He gave me this, he gave me that. Like, completely oblivious. And my son came to me and he's like, something's not right. I don't know why he's giving away everything. Like, it doesn't really make sense. Alhamdulillah that my son had come to me, because I then approached, the family and talked to them. And they found that the child had actually written a suicide note and he was planning to end his life. Alhamdulillah, he is 21 now, I believe, and he's doing really well because treatment was found for him. It was addressed. So don't turn a blind eye. If it feels like it's not right, it's probably not right. You know how we see in the airports, if you see something, say something? Yes, if you see something, say something. And there is no stigma surrounding it. And I think we do have to wake up, and someone had brought this to my attention during the Q&A sessions. There is a fear in our community, I think, that if you seek help or if you take your child to see a counselor, all of the other parents are going to pull their children away. Nobody's going to want to marry you. No one's going to want to connect with you. We have to stop that negative connotation that's associated with seeking help. And we have to normalize it. And the way that we normalize it is that we all get help. Again, I'm a huge fan. Everyone should have a counselor. All of my children have their own counselors. It's so important for us to be able to have that outlet, because we don't live in a village anymore. We don't have that community support. We don't have that companionship that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam had. Okay, so understanding the trauma brain. A few more slides and then we'll dive into the questions, guys, inshallah. So what does the trauma brain look like, or what does it mean when we have unresolved trauma? So we know that there are different areas in our brain that process emotions and situations. In the hippocampus area of the brain, that is the area where our mind records everything. It records what happens in a situation. It records, who said what were the smells, the sounds. If you've ever been to a place, I'll give you an example. Whenever I go back to Egypt, for instance, as soon as you step out in the airport or in the air, like, the smell hits you, right? And I don't mean like the burnt garbage, but there's a smell. And with that sense of smell, all of these memories come rushing back. you know? And subhanAllah, so I met someone yesterday who I had met in Egypt years ago. I haven't seen him since 2002, I think. And I called my husband afterwards and I was telling him, oh my goodness, I can't believe. And we were reminiscing and we were remembering so many of the things that we had experienced. We spent a year living in Egypt, studying there. And we were reminiscing, and one of the things that we kept saying was, remember the smell? You know, because smells can be very powerful. It's the way that our mind responds to those sensory elements. Now, when someone goes through trauma, the hippocampus records everything that is happening. But as time passes, the amygdala, which is the long-term memory, which retains certain elements from the hippocampus, tends to remove all of the external factors other than the feeling. So the feeling of the trauma is still there. I was scared, I was sad, I was worried about what might happen, I was terrified of this and this. The feeling is still there, but the exact details are not there anymore. And so what happens is that as you're going through your daily life, triggers can occur that can stimulate that part of the brain where it's not about the situation itself anymore. You may be in a safe place, but the trigger is there, and the feeling of fear, the feeling of worry, the feeling of not being in a safe place comes back. And that's similar to that situation of scrupulosity that I mentioned to you, that when the trigger occurred, the individual was no longer back in that country of crisis, back in that situation of pain and harm, but all of the feelings associated with it were coming back to the surface. And so you begin to try to process that trauma by responding to the feelings rather than categorizing and classifying the situation itself that occurred. And so a lot of times what we see with trauma, and we talk about trauma with a capital T and a lowercase t, because again, a lot of high schoolers, college students these days will be like, it was so traumatic. Oh my gosh, I'm experiencing trauma right now. Trauma with a lowercase t is still trauma. You may be going through a great deal of difficulty. You may feel fear and pain and a lot of emotions, but trauma with a capital T is a little different. It's when it impacts our functionality, when we're not able to function at an optimal normative level because of that trauma. And we often see the outcome of living with trauma with a capital T in what's known as the 3Ds, where there'll be dissociation, distance, and displacement. And again, we can go more in depth in this, maybe another time though, because I do want to get into the questions. But the outcome of living with trauma is you try to function, you try to move forward and exist in the circles that are familiar, but it's like having a burn, and that when you're burned, even though you're far away from the fire, even though you're in the process of healing, even if a light breeze comes near that burn, you feel it again, right? If water comes on it, you feel it again. And so often that's what trauma feels like, where it's like you have this burn or an open wound, and even though that which caused the wound is not there anymore, you're still carrying that pain, and your mind and your body is responding to the pain of that wound. All right, we're gonna go through some of these a little bit more quickly. Okay, I think this is an important one. So, the night of the election and also leading up to the election, we were getting a lot of calls in our offices of people who were anxious, who were worried about the future, who, didn't know what was to come and what would happen if this was the president, what would happen if this was the president. And these are all very human emotions of, having an anxious response to an anxiety-inducing situation, right? Because there are a lot of question marks about the future. And so I think as we head into kind of these next 4 years of our lives, we know that our communities will probably be impacted. We had a lot of young women, Muslim and non-Muslim women, calling and being very upset about, well, what's going to happen in terms of birth control, what's going to happen about Plan B, what's going to happen about, all sorts of things, and a lot of questions that feel very personal, as well as a lot of questions that are more community-based. What's going to happen with my family who's still stuck in, this country, in Yemen, in Sudan, in wherever, and I'm not going to be able to do their paperwork. What happens to, we have, a lot of clients who are DACA individuals, dreamers, those who who came into the country without paperwork, but because they were minors, they were able to go through the system, and fears that would end. So a lot of very legitimate fears. And this is where, again, we think about what is it within my sphere of control? What is it that I can do, and what is it that I can't? Unfortunately, we can't unseat the president, right? Unfortunately, we can't impact politics at that level. But what we can do is work in our spheres and our circles and say, what is it that can help address the fear that I'm feeling? What is it that can help with this anxious situation? All right, so I'm gonna keep going through these slides just to get to some of the coping mechanisms. Okay, mindfulness and grounding techniques, two very, very important ways of working through our heavy emotions. When our mind is going through an anxious episode, a lot of times our thoughts, it's like a runaway train, and it's like the thoughts are just running, and it's like almost like links in a chain. What if this happens? What if that happens? But what if that happens? And what if this happens? And how am I going to respond to this? And the mind can begin this overthinking, this overpowering, kind of overwhelming sense of thoughts. When we talk about mindfulness, it's about learning how to ground ourselves, learning how to come back to the present and recognize that what's important is the here and now, where I am, rather than where am I going to be or what's to come. It's what's surrounding me right now. And this is, again, part of our deen. We know Islamically there are the elements of muraqabah and hudur, right? Muraqabah is essentially presence or mindfulness, and hudur is presence, right? So in the Quran, we're reminded, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that it is verily in the remembrance of Allah that hearts find ease. And there's so much truth in that. And we see this in the mindfulness techniques that we're guided towards, even in modern psychology. When we look to the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, we see that Fatima radiallahu anha approached the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam when she was feeling very overwhelmed, when she felt that there was a lot of work that she had to do. And imagine our own lives today when we get very stressed out and we start to worry and feel like, I'm never going to be able to finish all of this work. And she turned to her father and she asked the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, can you give me help? Can you give me a person, a servant who can help me with all of the housework because it's too much? And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam told his daughter Fatima radiallahu anha, shall I teach you that which is better than the help of any human being? And she said yes. And he taught her the tasbih. He taught her to say, Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar. And what's so interesting is that in 2013, in the Journal of American Psychology, there was a study that was published that said in the back of the fingers, in the uqlas, behind the knuckles here, if you push on these fingers and you repeat a positive mantra, it works like acupuncture and it releases the serotonin in the body to counteract the cortisol. And subhanAllah, we look in our deen and we see that this aspect of the tasbih, of that dhikr, of that remembrance of Allah, is actually built into our faith. And this is why we say, faith, hope, and community are the critical components of resilience. So here when we talk about pausing the thoughts, slowing it down, one of the ways to do that is known as the 5-4-3-2-1 method. And the first part of this method, the 5, is 5 things that you can touch. And tasbih is one of the most powerful ways from a scientific perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective, to be able to calm the inner thoughts and to calm the body and bring it down a few degrees. So when you have those anxious thoughts, when your mind is racing, the first thing you want to do is just pause and touch 5 things. Maybe start with the tasbih and actually feel that pressure as you're pushing upon your fingers. Maybe clenching your fingers and feeling that you're pulling tight and imagining that which is stressing you out is in the palm of your hands, and then slowly releasing it as you are remembering Allah. And you're saying, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, Subhanallah. Maybe it's just touching the table and grounding yourself and saying, I feel the table. This is where I am right now, bringing yourself back into the present. So 5 things that So I tend to start with 5 things you can touch. The official way is 5 things that you can see. So you look around and you identify 5 things you can see, then 4 things you can touch. Or if you do it the other way, then it's 5 things you can touch and then 4 things that you can see. So save on your phone, a verse from the Quran, save a picture of your family, save one of those cute cat pictures that we get from online, right? Something that when you look at it, it brings a sense of calm, okay? But 4 things that you can see. Then 3 things that you can smell. Remember we said the importance of the sense of smell. Keeping maybe the oud from Mecca, from that Umrah trip that you took that was very calming. Keeping maybe a candle that smells like apple pie if that is associated with good memories. But something that you can smell, because when someone is going through an anxious episode, we often tell them, okay, take deep breaths. But the mind isn't ready to process that command. Instead, as we work through the senses with the things we can see, the things we can touch, then we get to the things we can smell, and it forces us to take those breaths. And as we're smelling, we want to inhale through the nose and exhale from the back of our throat, which is known as an H breath. And as we're inhaling, we want to lift up our shoulders, actually feel that tension, and then as we're exhaling, we're lowering our shoulders. Okay? So 3 things that we can smell, then 2 things that we can hear, a recitation of the Quran, something, I have clients who, many of our refugee clients will record the voice of their mother, the voice of a child that they've left behind, and they'll play that recording when they're feeling particularly anxious. So 2 things you can hear, and this one's very important, 1 thing you can taste. We talked about emotional eating slightly, eating disorders. The mouth is very powerful. When an infant cries, even if they're not hungry, we give them a pacifier, because that sucking motion and the swallowing of the saliva, again, calms the body. We do that for babies, but then as adults, we don't carry pacifiers with us anymore, right? But we still have that same superpower. We still have that same mechanism in our bodies where we can learn how to bring that sense of calm. I usually recommend to all my clients, keep a bag of like the Sour Patch gummies, the halal ones, okay? The non-gelatin ones, the Sour Patch gummies, or Warheads, or spicy mints, or something that when you put it on your tongue, it's gonna cause that immediate reaction where you're kind of swallowing your saliva, because that activates, again, those calming elements within the body that can bring you a sense of calm. So this is just one technique, one coping mechanism that I think often helps, but there are others. One of the most potent coping mechanisms is honestly looking around for the people in your life that want to help and not turning them away. Because when we're in that state of depression, when we're experiencing anxiety, when we're struggling with our mental health, oftentimes the first response is to self-isolate, is to go back into your shell, to not bother anyone, to not want to be a burden. And of course, that doesn't help, right? And we want to be able to look for those who are around us. When we look to Surah Taha, verse 29 to 32, we're all familiar with the dua of Musa alayhi salam, Rabbi shrah li sadri wayassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli, right? Which we say when we're in a difficult situation. And we know that Musa alayhi salam was in an anxiety-inducing situation when he was commanded to go speak to Fir'aun, right? His enemy, the one who wanted to kill him. And he recites this dua asking for Allah's guidance. But it doesn't stop there. The following verse, he asks Allah to appoint for him a wazir, to have someone be by his side. And he wants that someone to be his brother Harun. Why? So that he can be his back, be the strength in his back, so that he can be by him through this difficulty. So self-isolating in our moments of difficulty does not help. Remember during COVID when they made us have pods, people that it was safe to be around, and those pods were like our people for the next however months. I mean, New York, New Jersey area, they were really hardcore about the social distancing and all of that. I'm not sure how it was here in Ohio. But have your pod. Know who your people are. Who are those who you can reach out to, who are not going to say, what's wrong with you? There's people that are starving around the world. There's people that are dying in Gaza. Who are your people that will listen and just say, I'm here for you? Even if they don't have the exact right words, even if they're not therapists by trade, but that can reach out to you and respond to you positively. Right, so my hope is that through these conversations, we are destigmatizing mental health and mental wellness, that we're creating awareness, that we're providing resources, that we know there are ways and there are avenues and there are people out there and many different formulas that we can follow that can help us and help our loved ones and help our communities. So definitely grab our cards, connect with us inshallah. My cards are up there as well, and reach out. It can be overwhelming. What do I do when I need help? Do I go to a counselor? Do I go to CBT, DBT, EMDR? There's so many different avenues. You don't have to do it alone. Again, you can reach out to our office. You can ask us questions. You can say, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. What would you recommend? And that's what we're here for, inshallah. All right, in the end, another small example with another pot of boiling water, not the one that the frog was in, but a different pot of boiling water. Okay? In this, it was a social media story a while back, it talked about a young woman who was going through a lot of difficulty, and she came to her grandmother's house, and she was upset, and she said, oh, life is so hard, I don't think I can do this anymore, it's just everything is falling apart, it's so difficult. And the grandmother took out from the refrigerator 3 items. She took out a carrot, she took out an egg, and she took out a coffee bean. And she showed the granddaughter the carrot, and she said, describe it to me. And the granddaughter said, well, it's strong, it's solid, it's hard. And the grandmother took the carrot and put it in the boiling water. And she said, look at it now. And she said, well, it's lost its shape, it's soft, it has no strength to it. And then she took out the egg and she said, describe it to me. And she said, well, it's solid on the outside and it's soft on the inside. And the grandmother put the egg in the boiling water and she said, describe it to me. And she said, well, now it's hard on the outside and on the inside. And then she took the coffee bean and she said, look at it. And the girl looked at it and she said, well, it looks like it's got good color and it smells really good. And the grandmother puts it in the boiling water. And what happens? It changed the water and it didn't change itself. And so what we take from this is that life is going to be difficult. Life is going to be like that pot of boiling water. And we need to decide, are we going to be like that carrot where we start out strong but we let our circumstances break us? Are we going to be like that egg where the boiling water hardens us to the world and hardens our heart and doesn't allow us to have that softness and that compassion and that empathy? Or are we going to be like that coffee bean where without changing we change the world around us? And I hope, inshallah, that we'll all be like that coffee bean, bi'iznillah, and can be that change, and that it starts here, inshallah, in this masjid, in this community. Jazakumullahu khair for listening. This is our cornerstone contact. If you didn't grab a card, you can grab it from here, and you can reach out to us, inshallah. I know we've got a lot of questions, so I will pause here. I'll pull up the Slido, and I'm going to try my best to get through all the questions in the next 30 minutes. And you can definitely send more questions my way if you have more questions. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And Jazakumullahu khair for spending your Saturday morning with us here. I know that there are a million other things that you can be doing on a Saturday, but the fact that you're here, it means that you care. And that's important. Like the fact that you're here, you're willing to learn, you're willing to discuss and understand. Alhamdulillah, this is it's the right step to take to help ourselves, our families, and our communities. Okay, so the first question asks for my cell phone number. I won't advertise it here, but if you would like to contact me and you have a question, you can definitely reach out to me. I'll be here a little bit after, inshallah, and I can give you my cell number directly. And just use it for texting questions that are important, inshallah. I love you all, but I may not always be able to just chat. Okay, the next question is teens with ADHD and ADD are struggling with mental health. How can we help them improve and connect them with their creator? Yes, we are seeing a lot of children, younger and younger, being diagnosed with ADHD and ADD. We're also seeing adult diagnoses of ADD and ADHD. And for many people, particularly as adults, it's sometimes like it clicks. It's like, oh, like that's why I couldn't focus. That's why I was struggling with certain behaviors. For many children, when they receive this diagnosis, parents can respond in different ways. Sometimes it's disbelief. It's a feeling like, no, my child doesn't have this. Sometimes it's a delay in seeking treatment because of denial. Sometimes it's positive. Sometimes it's like, okay, let's explore this and let's see what this means. ADHD or ADD, it's not a death sentence. It's not a diagnosis to be ashamed of. Many times it just means that the child processes things a little bit differently. And I know, if you go onto TikTok or social media, there's all these people kind of showing you what goes on in the mind of someone who has ADHD or ADD. And a lot of times it's, there was once someone who gave a description where they say they enter into their car in the morning and they see like a speck of dust on the dashboard, and they think, oh, I should wipe that speck of dust before I get to wherever I'm going. But then they look around and they see that there's no tissue in the car. So they go back inside the home to get a tissue to wipe the speck of dust. But on their way into the home, they see that the laundry is still out. So they decide to grab a laundry basket and put the laundry away. And then after they put the laundry away, they're walking through the house and they see that, the lights are on. So they turn off all the lights. Then they're looking around and they remember that they needed the tissue, so they go to grab the tissue, but as they're grabbing the tissue, they decide they're hungry, and so they eat something. Then after that, they finally remember, they take the tissue, they go back out to the car, and they're sitting in the car, and they can't remember why they wanted the tissue in the first place. And by that time, they're already 10 minutes late to wherever they needed to be. Okay? And a lot of times, it's just a matter of processing, that when there's too much stimuli, sometimes the mind can't focus and zone in on what it is that needs to be done in the moment. Do I think there is overdiagnosis with ADD and ADHD? Yes. I do think there can be overdiagnosis, meaning I see a lot of our Islamic schools where a child who fidgets a lot, a child who is very talkative, a child who is not able to stay quiet during salah, many times I see, unfortunately, because our Islamic schools, again, very well intentioned and caring about our children and wanting what's best for them, but maybe not always best equipped to deal with different personalities or different responses, may sometimes jump to the conclusion, I think your child has ADD, I think your child has ADHD. Again, we never want to self-diagnose, we never want to diagnose someone else without following, the actual appropriate channels of seeking out the counsel of someone who is actually an expert in that field. But again, it's not something to feel like this is a death sentence, like my child is not going to be normal. It is completely fine to recognize it. To me, ADD, ADHD, it's just like saying a child is flat-footed, maybe, or pigeon-toed. I know I was pigeon-toed growing up, and my parents got braces, for my legs so that I wouldn't be pigeon-toed, so that as I get older, I could walk, with a straighter gait. My kids tell me I still walk funny, but they tried. With ADD, ADHD, it's the same thing. It's being able to recognize that there may be a little extra help that's needed to just get someone to a place where they are able to focus better, they're able to, control the attention deficit that's occurring. So how can you help them improve and connect with the creator? Treat that element of ADD just as a different way of processing things. Understand it, recognize that it impacts focus, that it can cause them to be redirected or distracted easily, and find those tools that can help. Don't make it a stigma. Don't make the child feel like there's something wrong with them, that, they're broken, because they're not. All right. How do you explain لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها? If people succumb to their depression and take their own life? Okay, that's a deep question. I was speaking to someone yesterday, and I was telling her that a lot of our clients, especially our younger clients who do attempt suicide and are not successful, will come back to our office afterward talking about what went on in their mind in that moment. And subhanAllah, every time I hear them telling me what they were thinking in that moment, it's very similar. Almost every time they tell me, I was not myself. And many times they'll describe what, subhanAllah, to me, it feels almost like the nafs al-ammara taking over the body. And the nafs al-ammara is that basis self that gives in to desire or an immediate gratification in that moment. And it becomes almost a removal of that fitra that we have, that natural goodness that we're born with, that strives for the nafs al-mutma'inna, the contented self. Because it's a moment in which you are so far away from the nafs al-mutma'inna, from the contented self, that you are so discontented that in that moment, in that immediate second, you need relief. You need to remove that bala, that heaviness with which you have been living or encountering. So yes, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, that Allah will not burden you with a burden that's greater than you can bear. But in that moment, when someone is thinking about ending their life, when someone is acting upon it, actively seeking a way to end their life, so many times they say they are not themselves. They are not who they know. And so many times these young people will say things like, I don't even know how I did that. I don't even know how I put that rope around my neck. I don't even know how I took those pills and swallowed them. I don't even know. And Allah A'lam, but to me this is that ghafla. When we know that there is the beautiful dua that we're meant to recite, where we ask Allah not to leave us to ourselves, even for the blink of an eye. Because ourselves, our nafs, is that nafs that it's not reliable when we know that what exists in us is the nafs al-ammara, the nafs al-lawama, and the nafs al-mutma'inna. And so in that moment, I truly believe it is a break from sanity. It is not being yourself. It is removing that which is good and the core element of yourself that's striving to reach that nafs al-mutma'inna state, and you are succumbing to that nafs al-ammara, not because you want to, but because in that moment, that feels like the outlet. That feels like what you're directed towards. And Allah A'lam, but once we stop, stigmatizing depression and suicide, once we recognize and understand that it comes from a place of pain, that it is the death from an illness, that it's not necessarily something that we have to brush under the rug and not talk about, inshallah, Ya Rabb, will be able to prevent others from going down that path. How do we help children as young as 6 years old with low self-esteem, which presents itself when they're frustrated or in a group setting? So for example, things like I'm the worst. Right? So remember we talked before about the voice that's inside of us and how we process that voice. Where is it coming from? First, look for the source. Where are these statements coming from? Why did they think they're the worst? Where did that belief kind of come from? Why is their self-valuation anchored to a false belief? And then counter it, right? All right, if you're the worst, why do you think you're the worst? Tell me what's going on that makes you think that. Provide the positive antidote to it. Well, I think you're the best at ABC. I see that you're the best when you do this and that. So providing that motivation, that encouragement, and decreasing the criticism can make a difference. How do you deal with mental health and depression while you're a single parent and doing everything on your own? How do you teach children to be better as well? SubhanAllah, great question, because again, we are seeing a very high number of divorces in our Muslim American communities now, and we're seeing a lot of single parent situations. And it's not easy, because not only are you navigating parenting with all its challenges and difficulties and struggles, but on top of that, you're also often navigating difficulty in the relationship that once existed, difficulty in co-parenting, difficulty in trying to be on the same page to raise your kids in the best way possible. I will say what I've been saying, since yesterday, you're not alone. Look for your village. See who you can surround yourself with, where you can feel connected and where you feel supported as a parent. And maybe it's not going to be your ex-spouse, or if you're a widow, maybe your spouse, your partner isn't there anymore. But find others that Allah Azza wa Jal places in your path that can help. Be a community. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to say, call up your best friend and say, hey, I'm overwhelmed, I need a break. Can you watch my kids for a couple of hours? Don't be afraid to reach out to the masjid. I know one of our masajid in New Jersey does a Friday night date night for couples where the masjid will watch the children and the couple is required to go out on a date while the masjid takes care of the children. Try to implement that here. Maybe once a month, do something for single moms, for single dads, do something for couples, but be a community that provides that support that's needed. All right, this is a good question. It says, finances can be a barrier to therapy, leading some to avoid seeking help. Are there resources to assist those who can't afford those services? So excellent question. And this is, again, where I want our masajid to kind of be on the forefront of this campaign. So alhamdulillah, we just signed a contract with one of our local masajid where they put aside $52,000 for this year to cover the first 7 sessions of 100 congregants. So 100 members of the masjid will receive 7 sessions covered by the masjid in order to seek therapy. This is a model that we need to replicate, and inshallah, not just 52,000, but 500,000. We have our buildings, alhamdulillah. Now we need to build our people, and I think our masajid are such a wonderful source of that. We also work with a lot of masajid that provide from their zakat eligible funds to cover sessions for our zakat eligible clients. For our refugee clients at Cornerstone, for example, the government covers in full up to 20 sessions per individual as they go through therapy. So there are avenues of help. It doesn't necessarily have to be a pay out of pocket per se, insurance, but also think about what you spend your money on. Sometimes we think therapy is too expensive because we're like, why am I going to pay $200 to talk to a person? But we will pay $200 on, the new TV, or we will pay $200 on something else that maybe if we were to think about it, it may not benefit us in the same way. I know at Cornerstone we do have a financial aid program for those who meet the financial aid elements. So we have some clients that only pay $5, $10, $20. It really does depend. And I know a lot of specialists also accept insurance. So there are avenues. Seek the help. Ask the questions, and inshallah you'll be able to find the way to cover the costs. Who can I ask for help when I'm struggling with feelings and friends? I don't want my parents to think I'm weak. SubhanAllah, it is not a weakness if you are struggling. And who can you ask? Again, if you are in school, maybe there is a guidance counselor. If you are in college, maybe there is counselors on site. But you guys have a great masjid here. You have a mental health committee. You have a community of people who are trying to change the narrative. Reach out to someone here in this masjid. Maybe you're a minor and your parents are not willing to, put you into therapy at this point, right? But reach out to the resources that are here. And if you're here in this masjid, definitely check with, I see Brother Ahmed here, so he'll direct you. He can definitely provide you with who to talk to, inshallah. How do we deal with parents that constantly fight over petty stuff and children becoming the parents? So parentified children is another situation that we tend to see in a lot of our communities. You don't have to fix your parents' marriage. Your parents are grown adults, and if they are struggling in their marriage, you can provide the resources, give them the card for a marriage counselor, give them the card, give them Cornerstone's card, okay? Give them the resources where they can seek help, but don't take it upon yourself. You don't have to fix your parents' marriage. And if your parents are really struggling, being honest with them, telling them how it's impacting you, telling them how the tension in the home, how the lack of tranquility, that it's harming you, it's hurting you. And just like they wouldn't want, anything physical to harm you, I'm sure your parents don't want emotional harm to befall you, but sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they don't realize the impact of what they're doing. In your opinion, shouldn't mental illness be disclosed at the time of marriage? Yes, yes. So premarital counseling is a must, I think, for everyone. I believe you guys have Sheikh Hussam does it. Yes, so huge advocate of premarital counseling. Please do not get married. Do not marry your children off until you have put them through a rigorous premarital counseling program. Mental health is one of the components that we cover in our 6-hour premarital intervention and education program. Absolutely, it is something that should be talked about. If someone has struggled with depression, if someone has struggled with anxiety, be honest, tackle it together as a couple. Don't go hiding it and being like, hush, hush, make sure you don't tell anyone, about the fact that you were self-harming when you were 12. No, your spouse should have access to that information because you want to be able to build things together. And if your potential spouse is like, oh, well, I don't want to marry you because, you went through a stage of depression, or because occasionally or you're taking anti-anxiety medication or something, well, then is that really the life partner that you want by your side? If you are struggling with mental health outcomes, again, know that you're not alone. Most of us are. Most of us have some form of mental health outcome, whether situational or chronic or clinical, that we have either had to deal with, had to address, or are consistently and currently addressing. You're not alone, but don't hide it, because that causes it to be stigmatized further. Where do you place dhikr and dua in the scheme of mental health treatment? Okay, great. That's why we had that slide about muraqaba and hudur. It is definitely a component and a part of our healing. Again, it's holistic. We don't say it's only this or it's only that. So, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that verily it is by the remembrance of Allah that hearts find ease. The dhikr is important, dua is important, but seeking therapy is important, counseling is important, taking medication if prescribed is important. It is all important. And so I would incorporate it in the process of healing. Let's see. Okay, there's a lot of questions that are coming in, so I'm losing sight of where we were. How do you improve mental health and connection with your creator without sounding like you're defying your creator? Okay, so first of all, recognizing that your test of a mental health struggle, that's your test. And that test comes from Allah. That's a test that Allah is giving us in this dunya. And we know that the test that brings us closer to Allah is clearly a test that is filled with blessings for us. If our test pulls us further away from Allah, then we have to address how we're responding to it. What are we doing and how are we reacting? Does depression come to a healthy person and then it becomes a disease, or are some people born with it? I guess whether or not it can come to everyone at some point in life. Okay, good question. So we said that there's different forms of depression, right? There's clinical or chronic depression, which often we find there is some kind of a chemical imbalance, hormonal imbalance, or a genetic strand, where we've seen it in families previously as well. But we also see situational depression, and we do see forms of depression that are externally impacted rather than internally, that have more to do with the response and coping mechanisms or lack thereof than it has to do with something biological or physiological. So I guess the answer to that question is that, can anyone be impacted by depression? Can anyone experience depression? Yes. Yes, just like anyone, God forbid, could have cancer. Anyone, God forbid, could have an autoimmune disorder. Anyone, God forbid, could have any other type of disease and illness. Yes, depression can impact anyone. Can we safeguard ourselves against it? Can we provide preventative measures? Yes. Applying some of these things that we talked about, recognizing the signs, seeking counseling, thinking of who it is that we can turn to and having those support systems. Does it completely, make us immune to the potential of falling into a state of depression? No, but we're doing the preventative work. Just like you would lower your cholesterol by eating healthier food. Does that mean you're never going to have a heart attack? No, but you're doing what you can as a preventative measure. Okay. As a mother, I often feel touched out. What can I do to not feel that way? So if you are a mother of young children in particular, there may be constant, hands on you. There might be constant, pulling you in different directions. As a mother of grown adult children now, my oldest is 23. Sometimes I miss those days. I miss those days of the little hands that are constantly pulling at you. But in that moment, it can be very difficult. Give yourself time, give yourself space, be able to step away and not feel guilty about giving yourself that time and that space, but also recognize that it's a very temporary state in which our children are young and constantly needing us. And before you know it, they will be turning away rather than turning towards. So find a way to release the stress that may be generated from that being touched out, but also learn how to kind of enjoy that which you have at this stage. Okay, there's a lot of questions, and unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to get to all of them since we only have a few minutes before Salat al-Dhuhr. I will try to do a couple more, and then we'll wrap up, inshallah. How can I know what is and what is not in my control? How can I not blame myself and overthink things and feel like I didn't do enough? Talk to a counselor. I think counselors can often help in helping you figure out how to navigate through your thoughts. What if you feel like your family doesn't understand you sometimes? The questions keep coming in, and then I lose the sight of the one that I was reading. I couldn't read the rest of that question, but it said something about what if your family doesn't understand you? So we don't get to choose the families that we're born into, right? Allah Azza wa Jal chooses our families for us. And many times those families can be a test, but in our response to that test, there can be so many blessings as well. So your family may not be the ones who fully understand you. Are you surrounding yourself with community members, with friends, with companions? Are you trying to understand your family so that they can better understand you? Because we're so often so consumed with this idea that, my spouse doesn't understand me, my parents don't understand me, my kids don't understand me, that we're fixated on ourselves rather than reciprocating that understanding, pausing, listening, asking questions, trying to understand the perspective of the other person in the hopes that they will understand us as well. Can you please make today's slides available? Absolutely. I think Brother Ahmed has them through email now, so you're welcome to share them if you just want to save them as a PDF and send them out there. Okay, there's a lot of other questions here. What is the role of grandparents if they're actively involved in childcare in saying something to a teen when they are making a mistake? Okay, so generational differences was one of the differences that we talked about yesterday, or we touched upon it. We didn't get to go into much depth in there. But there is already a generational gap often between parents and their children. Now imagine the depth of that gap when it's grandparents and their grandchildren. The number of years that have passed, the time that they were brought up in, their circumstances are very, very different. And so it's important to have healthy boundaries, okay? Healthy boundaries does not mean cutting off silat al-rahim. It doesn't mean that, I don't want you in my life. No, but healthy boundaries does mean being able to tell the grandparents, we love you, you're great, but I'm handling the situation, right? Being able to tell the teen, okay, if your grandparents have something to say, listen to them respectfully, but know that as your parent, we're going to guide you towards the outcome or towards what's next. So finding that balance in the family of healthy boundaries while still connecting and communicating. How do you deal with having a parent who has deviated from Islam and is more secular and liberal because that parent has their doubts about Allah? So again, that can be hard. I often hear that question about children, not about parents, but we know that our iman can be impacted at any stage of our life, whether adult or child. So for the child who's living in this situation where the parent has stepped away from Islam, again, think of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His uncle, didn't accept Islam, and yet he loved him, and he was compassionate towards him, and he protected him, and he was there for him. And so your parent may be struggling with their iman. Again, just like we said, with fixing a marriage, it's not your job to fix your parent. Right? You can give them da'wah, you can show them the example of how Islam has impacted you and how it's made you a better person, but don't take on the mantle of responsibility for your parents' akhirah. They're on their journey, and inshallah they will find it. I overthink that since I don't have real issues. Oh, are we wrapping up? Yeah?
It's because there are people who have some questions here. Maybe we can take a couple of questions. And maybe I would ask you, maybe we can have a Zoom organized at some other point, inshallah, and go through the rest, inshallah. So, any questions here?
Assalamu alaikum. I had a specific question for somebody on the other end of the whole process, right? I started exhibiting signs of depression when I was 15, and it took years to get help, lots of support from my family, lots of support, and I'm alhamdulillah way better. It's been a 10-year journey, and I'm on the other end, and I've noticed a trend People who started getting mental health help start exhibiting, and first and foremost, I've noticed this in myself too, where you start blaming your parents for everything. And I'm a very strong person, so I pushed my parents a lot, before depression, during depression, all the time, right? But you're getting to a point where because of the knowledge you're gaining, because you're working on yourself, you start pushing your parents down. And it's everybody else is whatever, but you start looking down on your parents and pushing them down like, because you didn't have this understanding of mental health, look at what you did to me, right? Like, and again, not pointing fingers at anybody, it's just something I've noticed. And on the other end, because I'm so much healthier, in my brain, I'm like I cannot thank my parents enough. They made a million mistakes, but everything they got right, even one of those things, I can never pay them back for, right? So my thing is, people take this mental health stuff way too far. There's not enough talk about. Appreciate what they did right too. Yes, break generational trauma, but where's the space? How do we look at our parents in even keel? How do we do that? And how do we talk to people about it?
Yeah. Jazakallah khair. I think that's a great question, and I love the openness. And I think, again, this is what we need more of, where we're not hiding, and we're able to share and say, you know what, I've experienced depression, I go to counseling, I seek therapy. Blame is a very potent force when you're trying to work through difficulty. We'll often look to blame, and a lot of times, in our couple sessions, we'll tell our clients, before pointing a finger at the other person, look at the 3 fingers that are pointing back at you and ask yourself, what's my position? What have I done? Where am I at? I think parents do the best they can. They really do. And so many times, as we talked yesterday, generational trauma is real. And parents who haven't been able to help themselves often are not able to help their children. And again, we say hurt people hurt others. And so many times parents, people will blame their parents because they are able to see everything that went wrong. But the reality is, if the parents were able to encourage or guide or recommend that the child seek therapy, then they've done something right. And even if they've brought the child to the point where the child themselves is seeking therapy, blame doesn't help anyone. It's like drinking poison and hoping the other person will get hurt. It just poisons yourself. So I think whoever it is that you may be blaming, whether it's spouse, parents, kids, in-laws, it doesn't help you heal. It usually hurts and harms more. So I appreciate you bringing up that point. Jazakallahu khair. I don't know if there's any more questions, or is there one?
Assalamu alaikum. My question is, I know that you have to surround yourself with positivity and try to avoid negativity, but how do you work around that for, like, say, if your family is the number one cause? And I'm not saying it's for me, but in general, because you don't want to avoid them and break kinship, but you don't want to distance yourself either, but you still need your own, mental space or personal space.
So again, we come back to family. There is a reason why Allah Azza wa Jal grants us so much reward for being good to our family. There's a reason why He commands us to lower the wing of humility to our parents. There's a reason why family is talked about so often in the Quran, because sometimes our family is the source of our pain, of our difficulty. And we see this in, the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, where it was his own brothers that caused harm to him. So when we look to the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, we see that even though his family was the source of negativity, his brothers, right? His father was not. His father was granted to him as that almost that counteraction to the pain that was brought upon him by his brothers. So sometimes it's about looking around and seeing, maybe my parents are difficult to deal with, but maybe Allah Azza wa Jal has granted me an aunt, a cousin, an uncle, a sibling that I connect well with. Not becoming bitter, not blaming family, again, as we said before, for pain or difficulty that you're in. read the chapter in the Quran of Yusuf alayhi salam and see how he responded to the test of family members who were difficult and how he never lost hope. And when he had an opportunity to really cause severe damage to those who hurt him, he didn't take that opportunity. And I think it's ways of finding forgiveness and realizing that our parents, again, they often do what they know. And sometimes what they know is already steeped in their own trauma and that they've had trouble unpacking that.
One final question, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, Sister Suzy. So I know of a young person who, because of the childhood trauma, could not bring himself, herself to forgive the parents or one of the parents. So I always think, the fruits of forgiveness in the hereafter, in like forgiving your parents for, treating you because they didn't know better. I mean, how long the parent has to wait for the child to forgive them and become normal with them.
SubhanAllah, that's a difficult situation to be in. And again, we do live in a society where a lot of times we'll see, even counselors telling young adults or teens, if your parents are causing you emotional distress, then cut them off. You have toxic parents, and so step away. And again, we go back to our deen and that concept of silat al-rahim, right? The thread of connection with family. And that thread of connection doesn't have to be like a thick, tight rope, right? Sometimes it's just a thread. And so you can ask for forgiveness, right? You can repent, you can explain why you didn't know maybe when you were raising your child certain things. But in the end, Allah is the one who forgives. And if someone holds on to that, refusal to forgive, it hurts them. So I would say you keep making dua, you keep asking Allah Azza wa Jal to soften the heart of the child who has cut off the parent. You keep asking Allah Azza wa Jal to allow them to recognize, that what you've done and how you've been seeking out their forgiveness. And you try, you strive, but you don't beat yourself up. You don't hold it in your heart. You recognize that in the eyes of Allah, you have done everything that you can do.
Jazakumullah kullu khair, Dr. Suzy. This is just a step, I think, and we need more of this, inshallah. So we'll try to organize, inshallah, another session and have the rest of questions asked, and maybe we can grow beyond that. Alhamdulillah, one more reminder, we have, alhamdulillah, the mental health team, so we can reach out to them. We have here in the room Sister Neda, we have Sister Sana, we have Sister Fatma in the back, and who else? Maryam Sulaiman, Brother Faiz. So reach out, and inshallah we'll post something regarding how can you reach out to the team. We need ideas, and it is much needed thing in the community, inshallah. So alhamdulillah, that's again a step, and we'll work forward to grow that, inshallah, that effort, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. Couple of things to announce, or you need your help. We need to clean the room before we go, so we'll need to stack the chairs back and the tables. And please give a warm load of applause to Dr. Suzy. Yani we used her time till she's her flight in 2 hours, so we just like finish and run to the airport. Subhanallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.